Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Adams. I'm 34 years old, and I've spent the last 34 years of my life trying to be good enough for a family that never actually wanted me. I want you to hold that sentence for a second, because I know how it sounds. And I know that saying it out loud, even now, even after everything, still makes my chest tighten in a way that I can't fully explain. Because it wasn't always obvious. That's the thing about certain kinds of families. The damage they do doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with bruises or screaming or dramatic scenes that you can point to later and say, there, that's when it started. It comes quietly. It comes in the form of small omissions, a birthday gift that's slightly less than your brother's, a conversation that stops just as you walk into the room, a smile that never quite reaches the eyes. I didn't know any of that was happening to me when I was a child. I only understood it later, when I was old enough to look back and connect the dots. But here's what I really need you to understand before I tell you what happened at my daughter's christening, the worst moment of my life. The one I'm going to describe to you today happened in a sunlit banquet hall in front of 80 people. It happened while my 7-week-old daughter Lily was asleep in her Moses basket. It happened while I was in a cream-colored dress that I'd been afraid to eat lunch in because I was so desperate for everything to be perfect. And it happened because two people who called themselves my parents decided that a Sunday afternoon in June was the right time to tell me, publicly, loudly, deliberately, that I was never really one of them. They stood up from their chairs. My mother adjusted her blazer. My father cleared his throat. And neither of them noticed the woman in the navy dress sitting at table 3. The woman who had been crying softly since the ceremony started. The woman who was holding a manila envelope in her lap so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. I need to tell you the whole story from the very beginning. Because what happened that day didn't start at the christening. It started 34 years ago in a hospital room I have no memory of, with a decision made by a woman I'd never met, and it traveled through decades of small cruelties and buried truths before it finally exploded into the open on the most important day of my daughter's life. Stay with me. I promise you, it's worth it. I was adopted at 6 weeks old by Gerald and Diane Adams. They lived in Westchester County, New York, in a large colonial house with a circular driveway and a garden that my mother won a neighborhood association award for 3 years running. They were the kind of people who made everything look effortless. Dinner parties, church attendance, charity galas, the family photograph on the Christmas card where everyone's teeth were perfect and the lighting was flawless. They already had one biological son when they adopted me. His name was Marcus. He was 4 years old, and from everything I have been told, the adoption of a baby girl was presented to him like a gift. You're getting a little sister, they told him, and apparently he was thrilled, at least for a while. I have tried over the years to piece together why they adopted me. My adoptive mother, Diane, told me when I was around 9 or 10 that they had always wanted a daughter, that they had tried for a second biological child and it hadn't worked, that they had opened their hearts and their home to me. She delivered these facts with the kind of practiced warmth that I later recognized as a performance, the emotional equivalent of the Christmas card smile. Technically the right words, in technically the right order, with technically the right expression. But even at 9, I remember sitting across from her at the kitchen table and feeling a strange hollowness behind her words. Like there was a room behind the room she was showing me, and the door to it was locked. My adoptive parents were not cruel people in the traditional sense. They never raised a hand to me. They never called me names. They fed me and clothed me and sent me to a good school and drove me to tennis lessons on Saturday mornings just like they drove Marcus to his. On paper, my childhood was perfectly fine. But there is a kind of emotional neglect that doesn't leave marks. There is a kind of favoritism so subtle that when you try to describe it to other people, you sound paranoid. You sound ungrateful. You sound like someone who is inventing grievances because you don't know how good you have it. Marcus got the bigger bedroom, but only because he'd had it first. Marcus got the car on his 16th birthday, but only because he'd asked. Marcus got the purdy when he graduated college, but only because he'd made the dean's list. There was always a reason, there was always an explanation, and I was always standing just slightly outside the circle of warmth, telling myself I was imagining things. I wish I had trusted myself sooner. If you've ever grown up in a family where you felt like the one who didn't quite belong, you already know what I mean. You already know the particular loneliness of sitting at a dinner table, surrounded by people who share the same laugh and the same jaw and the same references to things that happened before you arrived, and feeling invisible in a way that no one seems to notice, and you don't have the words to explain. That was my childhood, and for a long time I told myself it was enough. The first time I remember truly understanding that something was wrong. I mean, really understanding it. In the gut, not just sensing it like a draft from a window you can't find. I was 16 years old. There was a family meeting. My parents called those sometimes, and they usually happened around the dining room table, which was the formal one, the one we only used at Thanksgiving and when my father had business guests. So when I came home from school and saw that table set with the good chairs, I knew it was something significant. My father sat at the head. My mother sat to his left. Marcus was already there, slouched in his chair with the particular ease of someone who knows he belongs in a room. I sat down and folded my hands in my lap the way I always did when I was nervous, like I was trying to take up less space. My father explained that he had updated his estate planning, that he and my mother had worked with their attorney to make sure everything was in order, that they wanted us both to know what the plan was, out of respect. He didn't look at me when he said the next part. The family house, the colonial with the circular driveway, the one my mother won the garden award for, would go to Marcus, along with his grandfather's investment accounts, which were worth at that time somewhere around $400,000. For me, there was a trust, a modest one, enough to help get me started, my father said, enough to show that I was cared for. Marcus got $400,000 and the house. I got a trust that would eventually turn out to be worth around 40,000. I was 16. I did the math in my head and I smiled and I said, "Of course, that makes sense." And I meant it to sound gracious, and I think it did. But inside, something shifted. Something that had been slightly off balance my entire life tilted another few degrees, and I felt the floor of my understanding slope beneath me. I remember looking at Marcus across that table, expecting to see something, embarrassment maybe, or at least a flicker of awareness that this was unequal, and he just nodded along like it was the most natural thing in the world. Because for him it was. After the meeting, I went upstairs to my room and sat on the edge of my bed for a very long time. I did not cry. I was past the age of crying about my family by 16. Instead, I opened my laptop and I started researching, because that was what I did with feelings that had nowhere to go. I researched. I studied. I made plans. I didn't know yet what those plans would be, but I understood in a way I hadn't before that I was going to need to build my own foundation, because the one I'd been standing on had less underneath it than I'd thought. And still, and this is the part that's hardest to explain to people who haven't been there, I still loved them. I still wanted them to love me, back in the same complete way that I imagined they loved Marcus. I still showed up for Sunday dinners. I still brought my mother flowers on her birthday. I still called my father on the first day of every new school year, the way he'd started as a tradition when I was 7. I still tried. For years, I still tried. That is the cruelest thing about that kind of family. They make you love them, and then they make you spend your whole life trying to deserve something they've already decided you don't get. I was 18 when I found out about the college fund. Or rather, I was 18 when I found out that what I had been told was a college fund for me had quietly, over the years, been redirected elsewhere. When I'd entered high school, my parents had told me there was a fund set aside for my education. Not enormous, but enough to cover a state school comfortably. Maybe a bit more. I'd grown up knowing it was there. I'd made decisions based on it. When teachers asked about my plans, I factored it in. When I applied to colleges, I didn't apply for every scholarship I could have. because I thought I had a financial cushion. I didn't. I found out when I went to my father's home office to ask him something. I don't even remember what. And I saw a statement on his desk. It was from an account I didn't recognize, and it had Marcus's name on it. Not the account I was supposed to have. Marcus's name in a different account, and a number on that statement that made me stop breathing for a moment. I didn't say anything that day. I closed the door and went back to my room, and I sat with it. It took me 2 weeks to bring it up. I chose a Sunday afternoon when Marcus wasn't home, when my mother was in a good mood because she'd been to brunch with friends, when the light in the kitchen was warm and golden and everything felt as calm as our family ever got. I sat down across from her and I asked, as calmly as I could manage, whether she could explain the discrepancy I'd seen. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said with perfect composure, "Rachel, your father and I made a decision that was in the best interest of this family. Marcus had a specific opportunity that required funding at a particular time. The money was reallocated. You'll receive financial aid for college, plenty of students do." She said it the way you'd explain a minor administrative change, as though it were nothing. As though she hadn't just told me that the money that had been promised to me, money I had organized my understanding of my own future around, had been quietly given to my brother without anyone bothering to tell me. I said, "When were you going to let me know?" And she said, "We're letting you know now." That was it. That was the entire conversation. She picked up her coffee cup and she turned back toward the window, and the conversation was over. I got into a good college. I worked 2 jobs to help pay for it. I applied for every scholarship I hadn't applied for the first time around, and I got several of them. I took out loans for the rest. I graduated with honors and with debt, while Marcus finished his bachelor's degree using the fund that had originally been designated for me, and then used the remaining portion for a gap year in Europe that my parents described to their friends as such a wonderful experience for him. I want to be really careful here because I know how this sounds. I know it sounds like I'm cataloging grievances. And I want to be honest with you, I've spent years examining my own feelings about this family, wondering how much of my perception was accurate and how much of it was shaped by hurt and by wanting something that wasn't there. But what I've come to understand is this: facts are facts. The college fund was real. The reallocation was real. The estate inequality was real. The trust was real. These aren't feelings. These are numbers on paper in accounts with names on them. And when I look at those numbers, when I lay them out in a line and look at them clearly, the picture they make is unmistakable. I was never the daughter. I was the placeholder. The proof that Gerald and Diane Adams were compassionate people who had opened their home to a child in need. I was the living, breathing PR strategy for a family that cared very deeply about what the neighbors thought. And when the money came up, when the real decisions had to be made about what mattered and to whom, I was expendable. I graduated college. I moved to Boston. I built a career in public health administration that I am genuinely proud of. I met a man named Daniel who was kind and steady and who loved me in the uncomplicated way that I had been searching for my whole life without fully knowing it. We got married in a small ceremony. Small because my parents disapproved of Daniel, who didn't have the right kind of job or the right kind of last name. And we made a life. And somewhere in the middle of that life, I discovered I was pregnant. And everything, every unresolved thing, every buried thing, every drawer in my memory that I'd pushed closed and taped shut started coming open all at once. The inheritance dispute started, officially, about 2 months before my daughter Lily was born. My grandfather, my adoptive grandfather, my father's father, had died the previous fall. He was 91, and he had been in declining health for several years, so it wasn't a surprise. But the reading of his will was, at least to me, because I had not known that I was named in it. His attorney called me directly. That in itself was unusual. Not that I was in the will, but that the attorney was calling me separately, before the family meeting my parents were clearly expecting to have. His name was Howard Briggs, and he had a slow, careful way of speaking that I came to deeply appreciate, because slow and careful was exactly what I needed at that point in my life. My grandfather had left me a piece of property. It wasn't the family house that was going to my father as expected. It was a small lakeside cabin in upstate New York that he'd owned since the 1970s. Nothing extravagant, but it was his, and he'd put my name on it. And when Howard Briggs told me about it, I sat very still and felt something warm move through me that I hadn't felt in connection with that family for a very long time. He'd seen me. My grandfather, in his slow, quiet way, had seen me, had known, had done the small thing he could do to say, I know you're here. I know you're real. I know you're mine too. I cried in the car after that phone call. I was 7 months pregnant and sitting in a parking garage, and I'd just let it go for about 10 minutes in a way I hadn't let myself cry about that family in years. Then I went home, and I told Daniel. And Daniel, who had met my family at our wedding and had spent 2 days watching my father talk to Marcus and ignore me, and had never once said anything because he knew I wasn't ready to hear it, just held my hand and said, That's really good, Rach. That's really good. The trouble started when my parents found out. I don't know exactly what my grandfather had told them, whether they'd expected the cabin to come to one of them or to Marcus, or whether they'd simply assumed I wouldn't be included at all. But whatever their expectation was, the reality did not match it, and my father was not a man who handled that kind of mismatch gracefully. He called me 2 days after the attorney's call. The conversation was short and brutal in its efficiency. He told me that the cabin had been in the family for over 40 years, that it was a family asset, that it would be inappropriate for it to go to me, that he and my mother expected me to disclaim my inheritance and allow the property to pass through the estate in a more logical manner, meaning presumably to him, and then eventually to Marcus. I said, Dad, Grandpa left it to me. He chose to leave it to me. There was a silence, and then my father said very quietly, You've always had a difficult time understanding how this family works, Rachel. I hung up the phone. Over the next 8 weeks, as I grew larger, as Lily's kicks got stronger, as Daniel painted the nursery a pale yellow that I had chosen from a stack of paint chips spread across the kitchen table on a rainy Saturday afternoon, my father left 14 voicemails. My mother sent 6 emails. Marcus called me once, and when I answered, he said, Rachel, I really think you should consider what this is doing to the family. I asked him what he meant by the family, and he didn't answer, and we sat in silence for a moment before I said goodbye. Lily was born on a Thursday in April. She was 6 pounds, 4 ounces. She had dark eyes and a tiny mouth that pursed up like a rosebud, and she screamed with an absolutely extraordinary amount of force for someone that small. And Daniel laughed and cried at the same time, and I lay there with her on my chest and felt, for the first time in as long as I could remember, completely, fully, entirely present. My parents sent flowers. A nice arrangement, white lilies, with a card that said, Congratulations on your new arrival. It was signed with both their names, and it was the kind of message you'd send to an acquaintance. I kept the flowers. I threw away the card. I had thought about finding my birth mother before. I think most adoptees do at some point. But for me, the thought had always been tangled up with guilt, a feeling that looking for her would be a kind of betrayal of my adoptive family, a declaration that they hadn't been enough. For a long time, I cared too much about not hurting them to follow the feeling, but holding Lily changed something fundamental in me. I looked at her face, and I understood in a way I never had before what it meant to be someone's biological child, what it meant to look at another person and see yourself, what it meant to have a lineage, a thread, a story that was yours and no one else's. And I realized that I had never had that. Not once. Not for a single day of my life. So when Lily was 3 months old, on a Tuesday afternoon while she slept in her bouncer and Daniel was at work, I sat down at my laptop and I started looking. I want to be honest. It took a long time. I used an adoption search registry, a DNA kit that I'd done years earlier and never fully followed up on. And eventually, with the help of an adoption reunion specialist named Cora, who worked out of Vermont and had the most calming telephone voice I have ever encountered, I found a match. Her name was Patricia Cole, She was 61 years old. She lived in Connecticut. She had retired 2 years earlier from a career as an estate attorney. She had never married. She had no other children. I found her profile on a legal directory first. She'd been a partner at a firm in Hartford. And I sat there looking at her photograph on my laptop screen, and I felt the world go very, very quiet because she had my eyes. The same shape, the same slight upturn at the outer corners. And something about the set of her jaw, the way she held herself in the professional photograph. It was familiar in a way that no photograph of a stranger had any right to be. It took me 2 weeks to write her a letter. I drafted it 14 times. The one I finally sent was short, 3 paragraphs. I told her my name. I told her I was her daughter. I told her I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just the truth, and that I would completely understand if she didn't want to respond. She called me 9 days later. I was nursing Lily when my phone rang. I almost didn't answer because I didn't recognize the area code, but something made me pick up. "Is this Rachel?" Her voice was careful and steady, and there was something in it I couldn't immediately name. "Yes," I said. "This is Patricia Cole," she said. "I received your letter." And then she said, "I've been looking for you too." I don't have enough words to describe what it felt like to hear that. I have tried, since that day, many times to explain it to people, and I always fall short. The nearest I can get is this. It was like being told that a room you'd been locked out of your entire life was actually always unlocked. That the door had been open the whole time, and you'd just been standing on the wrong side of it, afraid to push. We talked for 2 hours that day. She told me everything. She'd been 19 when she had me. She'd been in her first year of law school, alone in a new city, with no money and no support. She'd made the choice to place me for adoption, and she had spent the next 34 years carrying that decision the way you carry something that never fully settles, no matter how certain you were at the time that it was right. She had registered with every search registry she could find. She had done the DNA kit. She had been waiting. We met in person 3 weeks later at a coffee shop in Hartford. I brought Lily. Patricia held her for the entire 2 hours we sat there, and every time she looked down at her, her face did something complicated and beautiful and private, and I understood that this woman was crying for about 6 different reasons at once, and that all of them were mine too. By the time Lily's christening was scheduled, Patricia and I had been in contact for almost exactly a year. We had met 6 more times. We had talked on the phone at least once a week. She knew about the inheritance dispute. She knew about my adoptive parents and their escalating pressure. She had listened to me, described the voicemails, the emails, the Christmas gathering where my father had taken me aside and told me that I was damaging the family by refusing to give up what my grandfather had left me. She listened to all of it, and she said very little. She asked careful questions. And then, one night in February, she said to me, "Rachel, I need to tell you something. There are some things I've discovered in the course of looking into your adoption that I think you need to know, but I want to wait until the right time to share them with you. Can you trust me on that?" I said yes, because I had already learned, in the years since that first phone call, that Patricia Cole was not a woman who said things she didn't mean. I invited her to the christening. I told her she could sit quietly in the back. I told her she didn't have to speak to anyone if she didn't want to. I just wanted her there. She said she would be honored. She wore a navy dress. She sat at table 3, and she brought a manila envelope. The morning of Lily's christening was one of those June days that feels like the world is trying very hard to be beautiful. The sky was that particular shade of blue that you only get when there's no humidity yet, and the light came through the church windows in long golden bars that made everything look like a painting. Daniel had been up since 6, nervous in the way he gets nervous, quietly, efficiently, making coffee and checking the time and pressing his shirt twice, even though it didn't need it. I had been up since 5:30 because Lily had been up since 5:30, and I had sat in the rocking chair in her room in the dark, feeding her, thinking about the day ahead. I was thinking about Patricia, sitting 3 tables away. and I was thinking about my parents, who had confirmed their attendance 3 weeks earlier and had not spoken to me since. The christening ceremony itself was everything I had hoped. Willie slept through most of it, which the priest found charming. And when she was held over the font and the water was poured, she opened her eyes very wide, looked directly at Daniel, and made a small indignant sound that made the entire church laugh. I stood there with the light on my face and Daniel's hand in mine and thought, whatever happens today, this part is perfect. This part is ours. The reception was at a private event space about 10 minutes from the church, a converted barn with good lighting and round tables and a catering team that a friend had recommended. 80 guests. People I loved, and people Daniel loved, and people who were there because they were family, in all the complicated and various ways that word applied to my life. My parents arrived together as a unit, the way they always did at social events, groomed and purposeful, with the composed expressions of people performing normalcy so fluently that it passed for the real thing. My mother kissed my cheek. My father shook Daniel's hand. They cooed over Lily in the Moses basket. They were perfect. They were absolutely, flawlessly, chillingly perfect. I had seen Patricia come in about 20 minutes before my parents arrived. She had sat down at table 3 without making eye contact with me, just as we'd agreed. But when I walked past her table on the way to speak to Daniel's aunt, she glanced up and gave me a small nod. Her face was composed, but her eyes were red-rimmed. She had been crying, or trying not to. I didn't know which. I noticed the manila envelope on the chair beside her. For the first hour, everything was fine. People ate, people talked. The baby was passed around to various arms, and nobody dropped her. Daniel gave a short, funny speech that made everyone laugh and that made me want to marry him all over again. His mother gave a longer, sweeter one. Willie slept through all of it with the magnificent indifference of someone who does not yet understand that everyone in the room is here because of her. I should have known something was coming. Looking back now, I can identify the signs. My father had drunk 3 glasses of wine in 40 minutes, which was unusual. My mother had barely eaten anything and was instead watching me with a fixed attention that I'd learned over the years to be wary of. Marcus had arrived late and was sitting at my parents' table with the look of someone who had been briefed on something beforehand. But I was happy. I was tired and full and wearing a cream dress that I'd finally allowed myself to eat lunch in. And my daughter was asleep 8 feet away from me. And for a few hours, I had managed to put the inheritance dispute and the voicemails and the emails and the pressure campaign into a box somewhere in the back of my mind. And then my father stood up. He didn't tap his glass. He didn't clear his throat and ask for attention in the polite, apologetic way that people do when they're about to give a toast. He simply stood up with the particular upright posture of a man who has rehearsed this, and he waited until the table conversation fell quiet around him, and then the quiet spread outward, the way it does when a room senses authority asserting itself, until 80 people were looking at him. "I'd like to say something," he said, and his voice was completely level, completely calm. I felt Daniel's hand find mine under the table. "I know this is a celebration," my father continued, "and I want it to remain one. But there are things that have been left unsaid in this family for too long. And I believe in honesty. I believe in not pretending. So I'm going to say something now, and I want everyone here to understand that this comes from a place of integrity." He turned and looked directly at me. "Rachel," he said, "when you were brought into this family, we made a commitment to raise you, to provide for you, to give you opportunities. And we did those things. We did them with everything we had. But over the past year, you have demonstrated clearly and consistently that you do not value this family. You have chosen to weaponize a piece of property, property that belongs to the Adams family legacy, as leverage in a personal dispute. You have refused every reasonable conversation. You have, in short, made it clear that your own interests come before the family that took you in." He paused. "Your mother and I have made a decision," he said. "We are formally removing you from our estate. We are no longer considering you a member of this family, And we want the people who are here today, people who know us, who have been part of our lives, to know where we stand. He sat down. There was a silence in the room so complete that I could hear the baby monitor crackling softly from the table behind me. I remember every detail of that moment with the kind of horrible precision that trauma gives you. The way my mother was looking at the table. The way Marcus was sitting very still. The way Daniel's hand tightened around mine. The way my face felt suddenly very cold, like all the blood had drained out of it and gone somewhere else in a hurry. The way my throat closed completely, so that even if I had known what to say, I wouldn't have been able to get it out. 80 people in a room I had chosen, at a party for my daughter. In a cream dress I'd been afraid to eat lunch in because I wanted everything to be perfect. I thought, this is what they planned. They planned this. They planned this moment, at this party, in front of these people, because they knew I couldn't fight back. They knew that any response from me would look like a scene, and they had made themselves the calm ones, the wronged ones, the dignified ones who were simply saying what needed to be said. I thought, I have spent 34 years trying to belong to these people. 34 years of Sunday dinners and birthday calls and flowers on Mother's Day and pretending not to notice the things I noticed, and forgiving the things I couldn't forget, and building a version of them in my head that was better than the reality. 34 years. And this is what it ends with. A speech. In front of my friends. At my daughter's christening. And then I heard a chair move. I thought it was Daniel. I thought he was standing up to respond, which was what I was terrified of, because Daniel can be very calm and very precise when he is angry, and I couldn't handle any more words in that room. I couldn't. But it wasn't Daniel. It was the woman in the navy dress. Patricia Cole did not ask for attention. She simply stood up at table 3, and she was the kind of person that rooms notice. She had the bearing of someone who had spent 30 years making arguments in front of people who didn't want to hear them, and there was a quality to her stillness, a completeness to her posture, the kind that doesn't fidget or adjust, that made the room turn toward her before she said a single word. She was holding the manila envelope. "I apologize for interrupting," she said, and her voice was the same one I'd heard on the phone 14 months earlier, careful and steady, with a quality I had finally identified after a year. It was the voice of someone who never says a word they haven't already thought through completely. But given what was just said, I think I have a professional and personal obligation to speak. My father turned to look at her. For the first time that afternoon, his expression was uncertain. He didn't know her. He'd never seen her before. She was a stranger in a navy dress at table 3, and she had just inserted herself into his most carefully staged moment. "My name is Patricia Cole," she said. "I am Rachel's birth mother, and I am a retired estate attorney with 30 years of practice in the state of Connecticut." She paused. "Let that settle. I was invited here today as a guest, but I came prepared, because I have known about this family for quite some time now." She opened the envelope. "In the course of reconnecting with my daughter over the past year, I became aware of certain financial arrangements within the Adams family that struck me as legally problematic. I am not here to be dramatic. I am here because what was just said in this room, in front of witnesses in a public setting, constitutes a formal declaration of intent that has legal implications. And the people in this room deserve to know the full context before they form an opinion." She set 3 documents on the table in front of her. I couldn't see them from where I was sitting, but I later learned exactly what they were. "The first document," she said, "is a copy of the sealed adoption agreement signed by Gerald and Diane Adams in 1990. In that agreement, both parties acknowledged receiving adoption facilitation support from the state of Connecticut. One of the conditions of that support, a condition attached to a state adoption subsidy that the Adams family received for a period of 12 years, was that the adopted child would be treated equitably in matters of estate planning and financial provision. That condition was signed and notarized. The room was completely silent. My father's face had changed. The composure was gone. In its place was something I had never seen there before, something that took me a moment to name: fear. The second document, Patricia continued, is a record of the estate planning decisions made in this household between 1994 and 2006, which I obtained through a legal records request filed last month. Those records show a systematic pattern of financial redirection away from the adopted child and toward the biological child, including the reallocation of a designated education fund. That reallocation was made without disclosure, without consent, and in direct violation of the conditions of the original adoption subsidy agreement. She said it the way she probably said everything in a courtroom, clearly without inflection, with the particular authority of someone who knows that the facts speak loudly enough on their own. The third document, she said, and now her voice shifted, barely, a half tone, but I heard it, is a copy of the signature on the adoption agreement. Specifically, the signature of the family's attorney at the time who was listed as a witness. I had this signature forensically analyzed 6 weeks ago. The analysis concluded with a high degree of certainty that the signature was not made by the attorney of record. It was forged. The sound that went through the room was not a gasp. It was something quieter than a gasp, and worse, it was the sound of 80 people reassessing something all at once. My father stood up so fast his chair scraped back. "That is absurd," he said. His voice was no longer level. "That is completely absurd, and I don't know who you are or what you think you're." "I know who I am," Patricia said simply, "and I know what I have. The question is whether you would like to discuss this here or in a different setting." She looked at him for a moment and then looked away, dismissively, cleanly, the way you close a tab you no longer need. "I would recommend the second option, but the choice is yours." My father sat back down, and for the first time in my entire life, I watched Gerald Adams have absolutely no idea what to do next. The reception ended about 20 minutes later. Not in chaos, exactly. Patricia had delivered her information with such clinical precision that there was no hysteria in the room, just a progressive, heavy silence that made people finish their drinks and start saying quiet goodbyes. Daniel's mother hugged me so hard I felt my ribs. Our friend from college, Jessie, found me near the Moses basket and took my hand and said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "I genuinely don't know," which was the most honest thing I had said all day. My parents left without speaking to me. My father walked out with his shoulders up near his ears, and my mother followed him, and Marcus, after a long moment of standing near the door looking at me with an expression I couldn't fully read, followed them both without a word. Patricia came to find me. She walked up slowly, the envelope still in her hand, and she looked at me with the careful expression I had come to know over the past year, the one that means she has thought about what she wants to say and has chosen it deliberately. "I want to explain," she said. "We found a quiet corner of the room, near the window, away from the last few guests." I sat down heavily in a chair and she sat across from me, and Lily, who had woken up during the commotion and was now alert and curious, looked from one of us to the other with the deep and earnest concentration of a 7-week-old who is absorbing everything. Patricia told me the rest of it. She had suspected something was wrong with the original adoption from early in our reconnection. There were inconsistencies in the paperwork that had been shared with her at the time, dates that didn't align, signatures she didn't recognize, conditions that should have been disclosed to her that weren't. She'd started digging about 8 months into our relationship, quietly, using the professional knowledge of a woman who had spent 3 decades untangling exactly these kinds of paper trails. What she found was layered and deliberate. The Adams family had received a substantial adoption subsidy from the state of Connecticut, a program that had been active in the early 1990s and that was specifically designed to support the adoption of harder-to-place infants. The subsidy came with strings attached, financial equity strings, the kind that Gerald Adams's attorney had apparently decided were inconvenient. The forgery of the attorney's signature on the conditions acknowledgement meant that the Adams family had accepted the subsidy while simultaneously removing the legal obligation to honor its conditions. They had, in effect, taken state money for adopting me and then quietly ensured that I would never benefit from the protections that money was supposed to provide. The fraud was old. It was quiet. It had never been caught, because no one had ever had both the means and the motivation to look for it. Until now. I filed a complaint with the State Attorney General's office 4 weeks ago, Patricia told me. I want you to know that I didn't do that without thinking carefully about what it would mean for you. But Rachel, this wasn't just wrong, it was criminal. The subsidy funds have to be returned with interest. And the conditions that were signed, fraudulently, are still legally binding. Their violation, combined with the fraud, opens them up to a civil claim. I sat there and I looked at my daughter and her Moses basket, and I thought about all the Sunday dinners, all the birthday calls, all the flowers on Mother's Day, all the times I had made myself smaller to fit into the space they were willing to give me. And I felt something very slowly, very quietly, shift inside me. Not rage. Something past rage. Something cleaner. What happens now? I asked. Now, Patricia said, we let the attorneys handle it. What followed was, in many ways, less dramatic than you might expect. That's not how law works in real life. Real law is not dramatic. It is paperwork and phone calls and long emails and waiting, and then more paperwork, and then a meeting in a conference room where everyone is very careful about what they say, and then more waiting. But the outcome was this. The State Attorney General's office confirmed that the adoption subsidy program records showed the Adams family had accepted funds totaling approximately $67,000 over a 12-year period. The conditions attached to those funds had not been honored. The signature on the conditions acknowledgement, the one Patricia had flagged, was confirmed by an independent forensic document examiner to have been forged. A civil lawsuit was filed on my behalf, with Patricia serving as one of my co-counselors, alongside a family law specialist named David Martell, who came highly recommended and had a reputation for being immovable in mediation. The lawsuit named Gerald and Diane Adams as defendants. The claims included breach of contract, fraud, and unjust enrichment. Marcus was not named in the lawsuit. I had thought long and hard about that. He had benefited from the financial redirection. I think he had always known at some level that things were not equal. But Marcus had not made the decisions and he had not forged the signature, and I was not interested in punishing him for being loved in a way I wasn't. That has never been what I wanted. My parents hired a defense attorney. There were several months of back and forth. My father maintained initially that the entire case was built on an error, that Patricia had misread the records, that the forensic analysis was flawed, that the subsidy conditions had been met. His attorney eventually advised him to stop making those arguments. In October, 14 months after Lily's christening and 17 months after I had first written that letter to Patricia, Gerald, and Diane Adams, reached a settlement agreement. The terms required them to pay back the subsidy funds in full with interest. They required them to pay a civil damages amount that I will not disclose here, except to say that it was significant. It covered the college fund that had been redirected. It covered the differential between what I had been left in the estate versus what I had been entitled to under the subsidy conditions. It covered legal fees on both sides. And it required them to put their home on the market, the colonial house, the circular driveway, the garden that had won 3 neighborhood association awards. I found out it had sold when Marcus called me for only the second time in my adult life on a Thursday evening in November. He didn't say much. He said, "It sold." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want you to know that I know I should have said something a long time ago. I'm sorry, Rachel." I said, "I know." And then there was another silence. And he said, "I hope Lily's doing well." And I said she was. And we hung up. I don't know what kind of relationship Marcus and I will have going forward. I don't know if we'll have one at all. There's too much between us that was never said, and too much that was never fair. And I haven't yet figured out which parts of that are fixable and which parts just need to be acknowledged and set down. But I know that his apology was real, and I know that I heard it. That's something. 3 months after the settlement was signed, Patricia asked me to come to her house for dinner. This wasn't unusual. We had dinner at her house in Hartford about once a month by that point. It had become one of my favorite things. the particular warmth of her kitchen, the way she cooked without measuring anything, the way she and Lily had developed a relationship that I watched from the sidelines with a feeling in my chest that I didn't have a name for yet. Joy is too simple a word. Relief is too small. It was something between the two. Something that felt like a door finally opening in a room you hadn't known was sealed. That night, after Lily had fallen asleep in the portable crib Patricia kept in the guest room, and after dinner had been cleared away and we were sitting with our wine at the kitchen table, Patricia put a folder down in front of me. "I want to talk to you about something," she said. The folder contained documents relating to her law firm. Not the large Hartford partnership she'd retired from, a smaller, separate firm she had built independently over the last decade of her career. A family law practice. 4 attorneys, a support staff, a solid client base, and a reputation in the Connecticut legal community that she described as simply clean. She had been planning her retirement for several years. She had been considering what to do with the firm. She had not, until recently, known who she might want to leave it to. "I want to offer you a partnership interest," she said. "A majority stake. I would stay on in an advisory capacity for 2 years to make sure the transition was smooth, and then it would be yours to do with as you chose." I looked at her for a long moment. I said, "Patricia, I'm not an attorney." She smiled, that small, private smile I had come to recognize as her version of a laugh. "I know that," she said. "I've spoken with David Martell about this. He's interested in the managing attorney role if you want him, which would handle the legal leadership. What the firm needs at the ownership level is someone with integrity, good judgment, and an understanding of how families can hurt each other." She paused. "You have all three, in abundance. I've watched you navigate this year, and I know exactly who you are." I sat there with my wine glass in my hand, and I looked out her kitchen window at the darkness of the Connecticut night, and I thought about the woman I had been a year and a half ago. Pregnant and scared and beginning a quiet, careful search for someone who might see me. Thinking, as I had thought my whole life, that belonging to a family was something you had to earn, over and over, in ways that kept shifting and were never quite enough. "Why?" I said. Not suspiciously, just honestly. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Because I have spent 34 years knowing that I left you somewhere, not knowing if you were okay, not knowing if anyone was really looking after you, and finding out the truth, finding out what that family did and didn't do, has been one of the most painful things I have ever had to sit with." Her voice was level, but her eyes were wet. "I can't give you back the childhood you deserved. I can't undo any of it. But I can give you this, if you want it." I said yes. Of course I said yes. But not because of the firm. Not because of what it was worth, or what it meant professionally, or what it represented financially. I said yes because sitting in that kitchen with that woman and listening to her say those words, I finally understood something I had been missing my entire life. Being wanted, being seen, being the person someone built something for. Willie woke up in the middle of our conversation, the way she always did, at the exact moment when the adults were most absorbed in something important, as if she had a sixth sense for it. I went and got her, and brought her back to the kitchen, and Patricia held out her arms, and Lily went to her with the particular boneless ease of a baby who has already decided that this person is safe. And I sat across the table from my daughter and my mother, in a warm kitchen in Connecticut, and I felt fully, completely, without reservation, that I had come home. I'm recording this now from my home office in Boston. Lily is 18 months old. She has discovered the word no and is deploying it with impressive consistency and absolutely no strategic restraint. She is the best thing that has ever happened to me. The firm is going well. David Martell and I meet every Tuesday morning on video call and disagree about at least one thing in every meeting, which Patricia assures me is a sign of a healthy partnership. I am not an attorney and I will never pretend to be one. But I understand people and I understand families, and it turns out that those two things are roughly 70% of what family law actually is. Patricia and I talk almost every day now. She came to Boston last month, and we spent an entire Saturday doing nothing more complicated than walking around and having lunch and looking at things in shops we had no intention of buying. At one point, Lily reached up from the stroller and grabbed Patricia's finger, and Patricia looked down at her and then looked at me, and I watched her face do the same complicated, beautiful, private thing it had done that first afternoon in the coffee shop. I have not spoken to Gerald and Diane Adams since the christening. I have thought about them, more than I expected to. Not with burning anger, but with something quieter and more complicated, a kind of grief for what never was, mixed with a gratitude for the clarity. Because here is what I have come to understand. On the other side of all of it, they did not disown me at my daughter's christening. They freed me. Every year of my life that I had spent trying to fit into a family where I was always slightly wrong-shaped. Every year of Sunday dinners and birthday calls and flowers on Mother's Day and making myself smaller. I had spent pulling against a door that was never going to open. And when they stood up in that room, in front of 80 people, and said the thing they had always meant, all they really did was let go of the door, and I fell backward into the open air. And it turns out that the air was fine. The air was better than fine. I don't think they're evil people. I think they are small people who made a large decision they didn't have the character to honor. They took money from a program designed to protect a child and used it to look generous, while quietly ensuring that child would never fully benefit. They told themselves, over 34 years, that it was fine, that it was reasonable, that the adopted child would be grateful and would never look too closely. They were wrong about all of it. But I don't have the energy for hatred. Hatred is heavy, and I have a firm to run, a baby to chase, a mother who calls on Tuesday mornings, and a husband who presses his shirt even when it doesn't need it. I have enough. I have, for the first time in my life, more than enough. And if you've been listening to all of this, if you've made it to the end of this story, which is really just the beginning of a different one, then I want to say something directly to you. If you are sitting somewhere right now in a family that makes you feel like the one who doesn't quite belong, the one who is always almost but never exactly enough, I want you to know that the family you were given is not the only family that exists. Sometimes the family that finds you, the one that shows up in a navy dress with a manila envelope and 30 years of waiting, is the real one. You are allowed to go look for that family. You are allowed to go find the door that opens. I did. And on the other side of it, holding my daughter and looking at the woman who gave me life and then spent 34 years looking for me, I understood something that I couldn't have explained to you at the beginning of this story. Some roots take their time. Some things grow slowly, underground, in ways you can't see, for years and years and years. And then they find you. Thank you for listening to me tonight. I mean that completely. There's something about saying all of this out loud to people I'll never meet that feels, I don't know, necessary. Like the last clasp on a locket clicking shut. If any part of this story resonated with you, if you've been in a version of this room, if you've sat at this kind of table, leave a comment below. I read every single one. And if this is your first time here, I'd love for you to subscribe because I've got more stories to tell. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other. This is Rachel Adams. Good night.